Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Minahan, the president of the New England chapter of the National Association of Corporate Directors. I can't thank you enough for joining this virtual event, The Future of the American Board. It is going to be absolutely fascinating and address questions that all of us who serve on boards have running through our heads at almost every board meeting. It's a joint program between National Association of Corporate Directors in Minnesota and us in New England. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Myron Marcotte, the president of the NACD Minnesota Chapter Board of Directors, who's here to help me open our program today. Now, before I turn it over to Myron, let me just cover a couple of housekeeping items. Please, if you can take just 1 minute to fill out the poll that you see on your screen, I think right now. We'd love to get a feel for who our audience is today. Thanks very much. Also, a reminder to remain muted throughout the program and to use the chat function to pose questions. No need to wait until the Q&A portion of the event. We'll monitor the chat box during the panel discussion and intersperse the questions as they come up. In fact, Alan Murray has already volunteered to be looking closely at the chat. Next, we know many of you want to receive credits for this program, credits toward NACD certification. To receive that credit, we have to know your name first and last. So please make sure that's visible on your Zoom window. If you're on this call via phone, send an email to Deb Rosenthal at NACD and New England so that you can receive credit. Please note and take note of this because it's new. By virtue of attending this event, guests are consenting to be filmed or photographed. Finally, the panelists and moderators' statements and opinions are their own, not the companies for which they work. Okay, now let me turn this over to Myron Marcotte from NACD Minneapolis. Myron.
Thank you, Kathy. And hello, everyone. Great to be with you. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Once again, Myron Marcotte. I'm the president of the Minnesota NACD chapter, and I'm pleased to be in that role. I'd like to start by thanking the sponsors. All of you know, as chapters, our mission is to provide world-class, director-centric local programming to allow peer-to-peer director exchanges as we focus on continuing to advance excellence across boardrooms across our country. And we can't do what we do without the support throughout the year of the sponsors, including those you see on the screen now. So thanks again to all of them. Secondly, I wanted to just, in the confirmation email that all of us received for today's event, there was a link to the Future of the American Board report. If you haven't already had a chance to download that report, we will put in the chat that link so that you can download it. It's a very worthwhile read, would encourage you to do that. And then thirdly, I'd like to just move on with today's program. And I have the honor of introducing the program moderator today. It's Alan Murray. Alan is the CEO of Fortune Media Corp, and he's authored 5 books, including his latest book, which is called Tomorrow's Capitalist, My Search for the Soul of Business. The themes written about in his book very nicely align with the Future of the American Board report. And it focuses on, it reminds boards that we need to take into account the interests of all critical stakeholders, which includes employees, customers, and communities as we look to build long-term shareholder value. If you're interested in purchasing Alan's most recent book, Tomorrow's Capitalist, we will put a link in the chat for that as well, and would encourage you to do that. I'm sure it's a terrific read. So Alan, without further ado, let me turn it over to you to kick off today's program.
Thank you, Myron, and thank you, Kathy, and thanks for the book plug. I would have done this even without a book plug, but I appreciate the book plug. And I would have done it because we have a really great panel to talk about a really interesting subject. Shelley Leibowitz is a technology advisor, well-known thought leader, and a director on the Morgan Stanley board and the Elastic NV board. Mario Marti is the CFO of Chewy, and also a director on Best Buy. And then Teresa Sebastian, who is a C-suite executive director at AES and Kaiser Aluminum. Thank you, all three of you, for doing this. I mean, before we dive in, I think I would just say that the last decade has really brought, and I speak as somebody who's been covering sort of the interaction of business and society for 4 decades, but the last decade has really brought a revolution in the way we think about the place of the corporation in society, and by obvious extension, the way we think about the role of corporate boards in society. The whole shift from shareholder primacy to stakeholder capitalism is a reflection of a pretty significant change in the way corporations think of their responsibilities, and employees and customers and society at large are raising expectations and demands they place on companies and place on boards. I was just on a call earlier this morning on what's happening in the climate area. That's where you kind of see the biggest and most significant evidence of this change. But you can see it in questions and discussions around diversity and inclusion, around broader issues of social justice. So I think it's a really great time to be having this conversation as this rethinking is going on. And Shelley and Teresa, I'd start with the two of you, because my understanding is you were both commissioners on this Future of the American Board effort, that it was the first time that there's been an effort like this in 15 years. And I'd love to get your sense of what has changed, why it was necessary to update the principles, how the world is different today than it was the last time this Future of American Board effort was done. Shelley, maybe I'll start with you, if that's all right.
Terrific, and thank you, Alan. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I always find at these NACD events, whether I'm speaking or just listening, I always walk away with some really, really good knowledge and good food for thought. And I'm constantly reminded about those duties of loyalty and care and what it really means to be a good board member, because we all know being a public company director is both a privilege and deeply a responsibility as well. And I think how to go about doing that, how to be a good fiduciary, has, as you said, changed pretty dramatically over time. So the Future of the American Board report, and it was a tremendous privilege to be one of the commissioners and spend, 6 months really, really hashing out a range of issues with a very, very wide range of skills and experiences and backgrounds in the room. This was an update to a report that I believe was issued right after the financial crisis. And what I like to say is, in a post-financial crisis world, the question was, or the topic was, do no harm. Corporations, particularly in the banking world, should do no harm. And at this point, the expectation is that corporations will be a positive force for good and a force for positive societal impact. And that's very different. Now, one thing that hasn't changed, and if you don't have the report, I would actually encourage you to get it in hard copy, because maybe it's just me. I find these days reading means I have glasses in one hand and a pen in the other. So I would actually encourage you to get the report in a hard copy, because I think there's a lot there and it's really worth it to try to digest it. So I think the reason the report itself persists, so it has 10 building blocks of board governance. And I think the reason those things have stayed and still resonate with people is it is principles-based guidance and not rules-based guidance. And I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. So for example, in my own situation, I serve on 4 boards in the for-profit arena. The smallest one has just completed its Series A, and it's really worried about growth and customer acquisition and frankly, getting from today to tomorrow in the current macro environment. And at the other end of the spectrum is a global systemically important bank. And so although the principles of governance of those organizations are the same, how you go about implementing them and what it really looks like and how it's evidenced is pretty different. And let me give you an example. So, and I'd like to come back to sort of two pillars that I think are incredibly important in this context, are purpose and culture. But one of the reasons I think the report originally and then this update was so well done is because it is principles-based guidance. So one of the pillars is about board composition and really who's in the boardroom. And what's not there is a skills matrix that says, these are the skills and experiences you should have on your board. And why is it not there? It's not there because it varies, because depending upon the entity, depending upon the maturity, depending upon the size and scale, it varies pretty widely. So the report itself gives you a set of guiding principles about deeper questions to ask and second and third order implications of your structures, but it doesn't give you that recipe of, here is a skills matrix and you put the check boxes in the boxes that your board fills. And I really think that's one of the powers of the report. It also means it's incumbent on the board members themselves to figure out what the appropriate governance model is, what that really looks like, what your committee structure is. To go up a level, if you will, I think two of the pillars that really are unbelievably important to me in this current context are purpose and culture. And I think more than ever, companies are being asked to be clear and authentic and specific in terms of purpose and culture. It's your customers who are demanding that. It's your employees who are demanding that. It's your partners who are demanding that. Certainly investors and shareholders are demanding that. And it used to be, frankly, those things would be either on your business card or on a poster board. Now you really need to have authenticity and consistency in terms of what those values are, what your purpose is, what service, what products you provide to the marketplace that are unique. And maybe you're not the very best, but your aspiration is to be the very best. Having a clarity and a transparency around that, and then being able to demonstrate that through your actions as well as your words is incredibly important. Let me give one small example, because I think people have long memories. And again, it's all of your constituencies. So we've all just come out of COVID. How did your entity, how did your institution conduct itself? What decisions did it make during COVID? Did it do everything it could to keep people on payroll? Did it think about the benefits in a COVID and post-COVID world that its employees and its suppliers and partners and sort of other constituencies would need? Those things matter, and people remember those things, and those things all affect your brand, your strategy, your market share, and your positioning. And I think boards have to think more strategically, more holistically about a much broader range of issues than they ever have before.
Yeah, Shelley, I'm really glad that you started out with that focus on purpose and culture, because it both, in some ways that's always been true, right? If you talk to someone like Jim Collins will say, well, the best companies have always had a strong sense of purpose and have always had strong cultures. But there's a statistic I use in my book to sort of indicate why that has changed and become so much more important in the current context. There was some research done a couple of years ago looking at the balance sheets of Fortune 500 companies. And if you did that in the 1970s, what you would find and say, where's the value coming from at these 500 companies? More than 80% of the value of Fortune 500 companies came from physical stuff. It was, if you had the plant, if you had the equipment, if you had the oil in the ground, if you had the inventory on the shelves, you could create value, or at least 80% of the value. If you do the exact same exercise today with the Fortune 500, more than 85% of the value comes from intangibles. It's like the connection people feel to your brand. It's the intellectual property that you have, all things that are much more closely tied to your employees, to your people, to the talent of the organization that can walk out the door every night. And so while purpose and culture may have always been important, that increasing humanization of the corporation has made it so much more important today. And if you're keeping an eye on the value of the corporation, you have to be watching that very closely.
Fully agreed. And I think one of the challenges for board members who spend 1/10 of the time that management does with a corporation is finding the right data points and indicators. So you really do have a sense of those things as to how your employees are feeling, how your customers are feeling, how your partners are feeling. And frankly, it's a heck of a lot easier to get lagging indicators than it is to get leading indicators. And that's another really important distinction, is making sure you get the right data and the right leading indicators so you can get ahead of issues, so you can anticipate issues.
Great point. Thank you, Shelley. Teresa, you also were on the group that came up with this. How do you view both what's permanent here and what's new?
Well, first of all, thank you, Alan. And I think, a lot has been said, so I'm not going to be redundant here. But what I will say that I really got out of this, and I'm glad that the commissioners worked on this. First of all, let's do a little bit of history. Although it was alluded to before, there was a commission that came out before, and the principles are from 2011. And when we looked at those, we saw that there was so many externalities hitting the boardroom, in the recent years. And boards had to think a little bit differently. Things weren't as much of check the box. And each company, and each board member in each boardroom was being hit in a different way by some of these externalities, like geopolitical, like, the social activism. And you will see in the report that it talks about, there's a graphic that shows you all of these external things. And we realized that these could impact each company in a different way. So it was very important to take those principles from 2011 and broaden them, and as was said, make them more principle based, so you could customize those considerations and those pillars to what your company was actually experiencing. And it isn't just about externalities, it's also about how your internal stakeholders are starting to reach more into the boardroom and desiring a voice. So again, principles based. What is the tone of the, tone that we want to set as board members? What is the culture we want to cultivate from top down into the company? And what are our internal stakeholders demanding of us in terms of human capital, in terms of how we go about what we do? And so by formulating this report and making it so that we can look at what questions should we be asking as board members today? Don't give me, a skill set matrix to fill out or a form agenda to fill in. Give me something broader than that. Give me a broader tool. So if I am facing issues of culture, then I can go to this report and think about, it gives me questions to think about, and I can customize this particular principle towards what I'm experiencing in my boardroom. So again, that was my biggest takeaway. And, that's where we spent a lot of time talking. And some of the nuances that are different too, in terms of consideration, much more focus, as you stated, on culture, because for those of us that are, from the audit or accounting industry, we know that COSO changed their framework such that they are now, they have culture as a part of, one of the pieces of its framework. So now, besides bringing in culture as a consideration, a lot of discussion and principles around strategy and risk. and particularly risk, a lot of information and frameworks around how do you think about human capital and talent. So it's not just thinking about your executive team, but thinking about all the way down into your organization, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it became a big consideration. And there is one quote that I want to put forth that is in the report, and I'm going to read it. It says, success and value creation depend on relationships with a range of participants. So when you think about a range of participants, that means diversity, not just diversity in terms of race, diversity in terms of thought, diversity in terms of experience. And the success and value creation still puts forth the fact that you don't abandon shareholders' desire for growth and for building shareholder value, but it just embeds that in a broader concept. So again, it says success and value creation depend on relationships with a range of participants. So you can see how the language now of our principles and in the Future of the Boardroom, American Boardroom Report is really broad and very principles based.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Teresa. And it gets to that whole notion that we perhaps stakeholder capitalism has been mischaracterized as something that's in opposition to creating shareholder value. It's not. It's that those relationships with a diverse group of stakeholders is how you create value in the modern world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better.
Mario, you get to view this both as a corporate executive, as CFO of Chewy, but also as a board member. How do you see how the world of boards has changed? You're muted. I would be
3 years, and you figure that one would know how to unmute first.
No. I would be hugely disappointed if I didn't get to say that at least once in every Zoom call.
Well, then I serve the purpose. All right, Alan, thank you for moderating today, and it's great to be with everybody, especially with Shelley and Teresa. I think the shift in the role of the board is not only the board's role is not only necessary, but it's essential in this case. It's the very relevance of the board and the companies they oversee are depend on anticipating and adapting to the changing demands on those very companies. So the shift from the shareholder primacy to at the center of decision making by the board. I think has led, and we can find several examples where continues to be a detriment to a company's performance and place in the world. Think about going in the way back machine to the Sears Kmart's, right? The focus there led to the company going out of existence, a company that should have thrived in the catalog. Talk about e-commerce, right? They owned that, and they just could not think of all they extend themselves aside from the very narrow focus that they had as a company. Oil and gas companies have the same issue to a degree, and they're moving very quickly to go beyond the shareholder, but to think about all stakeholders. All you have to do is look at some of the reports and some of the work that Chevron and BP and the others are doing. Some of the banks that are in the news, you could say, had that very narrow focus on the shareholder and didn't think about all the externalities, all the stakeholders. All of those examples, I think, have led and continue to lead to conflict of the company versus the other holders, the other stakeholders, customers, partners, society, the environment, regulatory agencies, and eventually it's the shareholder that suffers when that happens, when you have that conflict sort of surface eventually, because you're not thinking beyond your four walls and your P&L. So I think, said differently, and this is from somebody who's relatively new in the boardroom. I've been on the board of Best Buy for a couple of years. But I think the evolution from shareholder primacy that used to be the case, the primary goal of the board, to stakeholder capitalism is both an acknowledgement of the changing role of the company in society, and by the way, the changing nature of the labor force. Going back to your point, Alan, on being more intangible now, it is now we don't have necessarily workers that come in and produce. We have workers that produce with their minds as opposed to with their hands. And to attract that talent, you need to care beyond the P&L. You have to care about them as individuals and about the society that they live in. But as I said, it's an acknowledgement of the changing role of the company and the labor force. And also is the fact that for the company to thrive over the long, the board and the company need to fully consider all stakeholders. And so it's a necessary shift, is an acknowledgement of the shift that was happening, and it's anticipating the shift that will come. So I think it's absolutely necessary.
Thank you. And by the way, let me say, I was just flipping through the gallery view here. This is such a great, rich group of directors who are on this call. Please, you have better questions than I do. Please put your questions into the chat. There's already a robust conversation going on in the chat about capitalism without capital. But please put your questions in the chat, and I promise to get to them. But let me ask all three of you, because we're now 28 minutes into this conversation, and no one has used the letters ESG, which was a framework that was created to attempt to try and capture this. It's now become, there's been a huge backlash. Dwight Smith refers to the charges about wokeness. How is that affecting boardroom conversations, the political backlash against ESG? And I'll take any one of you that wants to start on that one. I suspect all three of you have had to deal with it.
Well, let me just say first that, since this is about the future of the boardroom, American Boardroom Report, it does not specifically address ESG as a separate principle. ESG, we don't treat it as a standalone. So it's embedded in many of the principles, particularly the principles on strategy, risk, culture, talent. So you will see it there. So how do we address this in the boardroom? At least in the boardrooms where I sit, we look first of all at what's our culture? What do we value? There are many things that come out of the term ESG. How do we interact with our stakeholders? Do we have a lot of impact on sustainability, climate change? And then we also look at what's our risk profile. And so we ask ourselves many questions, and we custom fit what ESG means to our stakeholders, external and internal stakeholders, and what ESG means to putting forth our corporate purpose and our values. And that's the discussion. And I understand that there, are some political elements now seeking to embed themselves, but believe you me, ESG is critical to creating shareholder and stakeholder value. So I don't know how, anyone can take that and say, oh, this is a political issue. It's really an enhancement of ability to service your stakeholders.
Yeah, and I like the way you put that. It's not a checklist. It's not, oh, you must do this and you must do that. It's how do we, it ties back to the conversation we already had about purpose and culture and values. How do those things get reflected through an ESG lens? Mario, Shelley, either of you want to add to that? I think this is going to become an increasingly important issue as we move into the presidential election season in the U.S.
So I would love to. And I think what Teresa said is really spot on. I don't think of ESG as a single thing. And I think, again, it goes back to a value set. And it's also not something for large enterprises solely, right? ESG, whether you think about climate impact or inclusion. It is really a whole set of actions and values that corporations need to evidence and boards need to foster, right? We all know the tone is set from the top, and we need to foster, whether it's the simple things of, if you have a startup, how many water bottles do they use and how much plastic waste is there? These things should not be controversial. And I think, again, I think it's an honesty that comes back to what are your values and how do you demonstrate and evidence those values, and frankly, reward and reinforce those values to all of your constituencies. I think that's what shareholders are looking for. That's what your employees are looking for. That's what your partners are looking for. I think there has to be a consistency. You can't have kind of a headline over social impact and ESG and other kind of headline phrases without having the actions behind that, because I think all of your constituencies will see that, will understand that. And at the end of the day, it's all about your brand. And then your brand affects all the other measures that are more of the nuts and bolts, the motherhood and apple pie of what boards are really responsible for in terms of sustainable growth.
Just quickly before we go to Mario, I mean, both of you have made it pretty clear that you think this is central to the modern corporation and is not going to change. But are you adopting your language? I had this conversation with James Quincy at Coca-Cola, and he said, look, if ESG becomes a dirty word in the United States, I'll stop using the term ESG, but it's not going to change my policies on water. It's not going to change my policies on reducing sugar content in the drinks. It's not going to change my policies towards human capital. Do you find, Shelley and Teresa, that the term ESG is retreating?
I actually do. I think it's gotten a bit of a bad rap, and I think people have bundled a lot of things into what that term actually means. So what I'm finding is the best entities, the best enterprises really think about it as a discrete set of values, all reinforcing, if you will, a purpose, a culture and a purpose and a way of doing business.
Yeah. Mario.
Yeah, I agree with everything Shelley and Teresa have said. I think the controversy seems to be mainly, as you stated, Alan, a political artifact. It seems to be a made-up sort of argument for the sake of an argument. But the essence of what ESG is about, it hasn't changed, and it probably unlikely to change. It is doing well by the environment, having the right representation inside the company, and serving customers of all kinds and all backgrounds and all the diversity. All types of diversity. So that doesn't change. There was an article, I think it was in the Times recently, that talked about the anti-ESG movement. So that gives you an idea of already how this sort of reaction by the anti-ESG, whatever movement that was, political noise, is already seeing some resistance, because again, the essence of what it's about hasn't changed, and we all want a society we can live in, an environment where we can breathe the air and water that is clean, and so that is where there's no going back, I think, for the board on pushing this area. The language may need to change, but that's with anything else. That's just adapting to the environment.
The other, of course, big change that all of you are wrestling with beyond this redefinition of the purpose of the corporation is technology. Sudhakar Gadimukala, I hope I pronounced that right, Sudhakar, but I apologize if I didn't. Asks how digital transformation, and particularly AI, and the focus in the last 5 months on generative AI, how is that changing the boardroom? Who would like to take that one on?
Yeah, I'll start the discussion here. It is changing the boardroom. It's changing our perspective of our risk profile. For example, at one of the companies where I sit on the board, we actually have a committee on innovation and technology, because we are all about, energy, and energy requires a lot of research and development. A lot of changes are taking place, especially relative to, how we impact, climate change. So there is a lot of focus, and it's incumbent upon boards to make it a great part of your strategic planning as well. Challenge management to say, okay, how is, artificial intelligence, how are these other technological advances impacting the company? How is it impacting our competitive position? What do we need to do? What kind of capital do we have to put forth in order to stay competitive, in order to continue generating shareholder value? How does it change our definition of who our stakeholders are? So yes, technology and the advancements are really broadening the discussions, and board members need to educate themselves so that when we come into the boardroom, we know the appropriate questions to ask. We have the correct and transparent communications with management. And again, those are principles that are embedded within the Future American Board Report.
I'd love to jump in if I could, Alan.
Yeah, please.
Because I see two things that I think are real game changers in the technology world. And frankly, they're there already, but they're not as widespread as they will be. And they both require a different conversation and grown-ups in the room, and it's complicated. And I would say the first is a convergence of the digital and physical worlds. So when we think about industrial control systems and the digital world controlling the physical world, think of water systems, right? That has a whole bunch of implications that are pretty dramatic. And I like to say, are these opportunities or are they risks? Yes. Right? The answer is yes to both. And how do you position them and how do you think about them? Actually, there's a fabulous book called Army of None. We all live in a world where we're watching what's happening in Ukraine, written by a researcher named Paul Scharr. And he talks about autonomous weaponry. And basically, he says, all modern weaponry is fully autonomous. And the real question is the degrees of freedom that we as human beings grant those autonomous weapons? Meaning, can they make lethal decisions on their own? Or is there human intervention in that decision-making chain? But I think the whole idea of the convergence of the digital and physical world is one really big kind of theme and bucket that has pretty dramatic impact.
And Shelley, I feel like this ties back to your earlier comments. Both all three of you were making about the importance of culture. I mean, I moderate a lot of conversations among corporate executives about technological change, and I find almost without exception, within about 15 minutes, everybody realizes that they're no longer talking about technology; they're talking about culture. How do you create a culture among your employees where these are seen as opportunities, not risks? How do you create a culture among your employees where they understand the values of the application of the technology to make sure you maximize the positive benefits and minimize the negative benefits? So I think it's, in a way, it's made the whole culture conversation even more important and more complicated.
It is the adult oversight. And when it comes to AI, machine learning, data, decision-making, I was at an NACD conference on cybersecurity last week, and there was an expert in sort of AI and generative AI speaking. And I raised my hand and I said, can you tell me whether you believe there is explainable AI? And there isn't really a good answer as near as I can tell. But if we don't have explainable AI, it becomes exceedingly difficult to oversee it. There's a lot you can do in terms of the data sets you feed into it, the controls you put around it. But these are really complex issues and questions that I suspect boards and frankly society will be struggling with for a fair amount of time to come.
Yeah. Mario, you're very much in the technology business, both in your company and your board work. How do you view this?
Yes, and I would tell you from a company standpoint, one of the things that a retailer, a customer-facing company like Chewy or even like Best Buy, there's certainly a role for AI or whatever we want to call it, that is rules-based decision making or action taking, that makes sense. But then when you lose that, we've been careful, at least at Chewy, been very careful about using that in areas like customer service, because the moment you get a rules-based algorithm to decide whether to make a refund, a replacement, how to respond to a customer inquiry, you lose that connection to one of your major stakeholders, the customer, and therefore you kind of lose your way. So certainly there are lots of ways to apply it internally and we are doing that at both Best Buy and Chewy. But there are certain parts where even when it makes sense to deploy that the technology, you wouldn't want to. I think you give up too much in that process.
Those are hard decisions, aren't they?
Very hard, because every dollar, especially when the market demands more incremental profits every single year, and you have to decide, okay, this cost I'm willing to take, and I'm willing to explain it, and I'm willing to figure out how to talk to investors about. But it makes sense, at least to us it does.
Yeah. So, we've talked about shareholder capitalism. We've talked about technology. I mean, the other thing that the last year has imposed on companies is geopolitics as a significant concern. I don't think we've ever had, in my 40 years of reporting on this stuff, an event like like Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the spontaneous reaction of companies. It wasn't waiting for sanctions like in the Iran case. It was, we have to do this because of our values. And the only thing I can think of that was anything like that was the action against South Africa in the 70s and 80s, which played out over 15 years. This played out over two or 3 weeks. How are the three of you thinking about the role of geopolitics in corporate decision making?
But I'll start.
Yeah, go ahead, Mario.
Yeah, so the question of whether companies can be or geopolitical actors, I think it's we already are, and when we move supply chain, when we move production, when we have staffing in another country, when we move it from the U.S. to Latin America, for example, like we're making financial, we're making operational, and in the end, we're making political decisions that the stability and the structure of the relationship between the countries will remain stable or improve. I think of Nike when they first launched into China 30 years ago, was it something like that, or maybe more? That was a big risk. A country that was barely opening up, but the market was there, and they could find both customers and production there. So they made a geopolitical decision at that point, and they're making one today. And as the relationship gets strained between the U.S. and China. But we're going back to sort of the decisions we make when we decide to enter a market, when we leave a market, like in Russia right now being exited. We're making political decisions. Team members come from many different geographies and cultures, and so we're choosing them as well. They're choosing us, and they're choosing where to work every single day. And they look at the company and how they're behaving in terms of their decisions and what markets they serve. But I think the biggest role that I've seen us play, at least on the Best Buy board, as we navigate some of the big global issues like Russia invading Ukraine, even more close to home is China and forced labor, the Uyghur people. That matters to a company like Best Buy in the electronics world, where so much of the production, so much of the raw materials, first of all, but so much of the production is so concentrated in China that we have to make decisions over time on how to diversify our supply chain and do so in a way that doesn't create new problems in the new markets that we enter into. If we move production to Vietnam, are we putting too much of a strain on that society? Or are we going to create new issues for that society so we're just importing the issues from one to the other. So it's a multi-year, very, very slow process. It really has to be, but has to be really very well thought out. But again, we're making a geopolitical decision in that case that Vietnam is going to be for example, a good long-term relationship. I think as a board, the best we can do is to set guardrails or to help the company, the management team set guardrails and guiding principles so that when they have to make a decision in terms of speaking up about certain subjects, that they don't have to go back to square one every single time. They know sort of where to stay in and what sort of boundaries to prevent sort of us getting too far ahead of ourselves sometimes. Teresa.
Yeah, Mario, I think you're saying exactly right. At one of my boards, we have to think about, okay, we were sourcing in China. Now there's this whole political issue going on there. Do we move our sourcing to Taiwan or to Japan? Oh, well, there's some relationship issues there. And then we also have to think about our customers as well, and what will our moving our sourcing from one place to another impact our relationship is also, with our customers. Do they have a point of view? Will they look at us from a reputational standpoint and decide to source from someone else? So it's not just, are we trying to make a statement, from where we, navigate our supply chain, but how is that going to affect, us financially? Do we need to create long-term contracts? There are so many factors that go into this, everything from financial risk to reputational risk. And also make a decision, if we are making a political statement, make sure that everyone in the board, as well as executive management, we all talk about that, communicate that, and decide, is this the face that we want to put in? Do we want to step into this space by changing how we alter our supply chain? And with that, we're possibly making a political decision.
Shelley, does this change decisions about the makeup of the board? Do you need to have geopolitical expertise? I mean, some companies, oil companies or some big banks maybe always have, but it is dramatically different than 10 years ago.
So it's a great question. And I would say you either need to have it or acquire it. So I don't know that there's any one answer. On the Morgan Stanley board, for example, there are a couple of people who have real deep geopolitical expertise, and that's tremendous. If you don't have that, like a lot of topics, I think it's really important to get that. There's nothing wrong with a board bringing in a speaker, an expert, to talk about this for an hour and to challenge the board in terms of what the implications of the geopolitical upheaval and unrest is for your business. Because I think at the end of the day, the word that comes to mind for me is resiliency. Boards are being asked to think about and plan for a whole range of scenarios and not respond, but be resilient, be ahead of it. Because I think a lot of what Teresa and Mario have talked about is these are long-term decisions. If it's a physical supply chain issue, if it's manufacturing, that's not an overnight. You really need to think about long-term. And the same is true of workforce, right? If you have remote sites for various kinds of capabilities, that is a long-term strategy and something that you really need to be intentional and methodical about.
Yeah, I won't put the three of you on the spot on this, but I know I've talked to many CEOs over the course of the last year who said that any company that had a significant business in China has war gamed an invasion of Taiwan as, what would we do if that were to happen? So it is an unavoidable topic. But the other thing that, and I can speak with some authority on this as a journalist, the other thing that has changed is this willingness to speak out on controversial social issues. I mean, as somebody who's spent a good part of my life and career trying to get business leaders to speak out on controversial issues, I can tell you that the standard go-to response 10 years ago was no way. I'm under my desk. I'm not going to talk about something that doesn't directly affect my bottom line if it's controversial. And that started to change. I don't know, there was the Indiana Religious Liberties law in 2014 or 15, I think. Mark Benioff at Salesforce, said, I'm going to move my companies out, move my facilities out of Indiana. There was a similar event in North Carolina with transgender access to public bathrooms. you had the whole explosion over President Trump's comments on the Charlottesville riots and the reaction of CEOs who were pulling off of his advisory boards because of his apparent ambivalence. It probably peaked with the George Floyd killing, where if you go back to Ferguson, Missouri, which was, I don't know, 8 years earlier, I can't find any CEOs who made comments about what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, but you can hardly find a CEO who didn't speak out about the George Floyd killing. So there was a sea change over the course of about 7 or 8 years. And then people started to have some second thoughts. Voting rights in Georgia and Texas became like, do we speak out? Do we not speak out? It's become so political. The Dobbs decision was an interesting case. Every company I talked to wanted to make sure they were preserving choice for the women who worked for them, but didn't want to say anything publicly. Please keep me out of the public debate, if at all possible. And I just wonder, it's been such a kind of tumultuous decade for that whole issue of when do you speak out to support your values and when do you keep quiet. I'd love to hear from all three of you on how the companies that you're working with are dealing with that issue. Shelley, you want to take that one first?
Sure. And I'm going to give you sort of an answer or non-answer. The answer is it's complicated, right? There's certain CEOs who, by their very nature, tend to be more visible, more vocal. It's what they do. It's part of their DNA. And there are other CEOs who feel much more strongly about, if you will, keeping to their swim lanes. It's interesting. I was in a board conversation about this topic, and one of the questions was, and I think it's really an interesting question, is if we do or don't speak on topic X, the next time something that's really important and hits the headlines comes up, if we speak on this and we don't speak on this, are we messaging that this is less important to us? And so I think there's a lot at play, and I'm not going to give you an easy answer, Alan, because I don't think there is an easy answer. I think it's a really important boardroom discussion. And I think what boards are supposed to do well is set guardrails and expectations. And again, I'm a big believer in principles rather than rules. And I'm just going to say it depends. It's important to act with honesty and integrity and be consistent with your values. But I think it's just really a tough one.
Yeah. Teresa?
Yeah, let me add a different element to it as well. I agreed with everything that was said by Shelley. We sit at our age range, us as board members, we've got to remember that in 5 years, we're going to have leaders that are from the millennial generation, right? That are younger than we are now. But here's the thing, we are hiring them today, and they want to work at a place that reflects their values as well. They are pushing today on boards and on executive officers to speak out. And if they don't speak out, then they won't work there. So that, I think that momentum is going to increase. So it's almost incumbent upon us as board members today to push ourselves a little bit to say, yes, before it was no comment, it has nothing to do with our bottom line. But guess what? Our human capital, our workforce wants us to speak up and speak out. So as board members, we have to have some very deliberate discussions about where we're going to take a stand, where we are not. What do our stakeholders want from us? Our stakeholders in some part being our employees and our future employees, those coming through the pipeline that will be future leaders. We can take the example of Disney, where they spoke out about, a part of their workforce. And now they find themselves mired in all of these political issues, but their workforce to some extent appreciated the stand that they took. So I just wanted to add that element to this discussion as we're talking about, where do we speak out as a company?
Yeah, I can tell you, I had the opportunity to ask the no longer CEO of Disney whether he regretted speaking out. You know, it was sort of an odd moment where he didn't say anything for 2 weeks, and then he did speak out. And his view was, I didn't really have a choice. I mean, there was a revolt among arguably the most valuable employees that company has, the talented employees who create the magic, you know, the entertainment magic, and they found it unacceptable. I think, you know, one of the things he said was they had all had such experiences themselves when they were in school, feeling marginalized or bullied or whatever, and it was just a very emotional issue for them. And at the end of the day, he came to the conclusion he had no choice. He had to speak out in defense of this group of people. So there is something different going on in that interaction than there was in the past. Mario, how do you see it?
Yeah, I think Teresa's point on the labor force, it goes back to was a really spot on. It goes back to the point we made earlier, that labor force today is not production with hands mostly. It's going to be productions with your minds, and you have to have that affinity to the company, respect, affinity, love, whatever you want to call it, so that you show up every single day and give your best of your mind to the company. And if there's no connection there, if there's no real a meeting of the minds in terms of the company's values and the team members or the employees' values, then those relationships are kind of short-lived, or at least they're not as productive as they could be. One of the things that I put in the chat window that Neera was asking is, how do we think about the guardrails that as a board we set for management and for ourselves in terms of when to speak up? And what I was thinking is, the way we thought about it is in concentric circles. It is if it is within your city, your state, your society, as a company, you have to speak up. There's no way, and I say this knowing how, at least acknowledging how hard it must have been for Bob at Disney to actually say something or not say something, but it's like there's no way he could not have said something. It is in Florida, the home base for Walt Disney World. In many ways, it's like you have to speak up on something like that, and then you think about how it affects society, your team members, your partners. And if you're not acknowledging that in that sense, then you're missing out on opportunity to really make a difference as a company, an influential company like a Disney. If Disney were to speak loudly about I don't know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's okay, maybe that obviously important, but it's not as tightly connected to their world. Right. And so I think Teresa is exactly right on that, and it is you have to think about those guardrails in circles.
And Clint Greenleaf raises the point in the chat that this is, you know, you're all dealing with a complex set of stakeholders on an issue like the Disney issue. You probably have people who you have stakeholders on both sides of the issue. That was the same with the Dobbs decision, stakeholders on both sides of the issue. So on the one hand, you can have values and you can have a certain approach to your employees. On the other hand, you have to be respectful of stakeholders on the other side. It's complicated, right? These are not easy things. You know, what's so interesting about the conversation we've been having for the last hour is Shelley, you set it up for us at the very beginning. So much of it is about culture, about how you create the right culture for the company to succeed and create value. And, you know, we know how to measure shareholder returns. We've got a couple hundred years of history and the big four accounting firms and plenty of people who know how to do those calculations. Culture is much squishier, much harder to measure. Diane Hessen asks the three of you if there are some best practices. You know, I think she says sometimes there's a sense that you're just listening to the words of senior management who will most likely be telling the board how wonderful their culture is. But are there techniques and best practices that the three of you have seen that enable you to truly assess, monitor, hold management accountable for corporate culture?
Oh, so I think that's a great question because you can't just accept, if you will, the word of the CEO or the most senior members of management. So there are a whole range of things that I think boards can and should be doing to understand what's really going on, if you will, beneath the surface. And particularly if you're with a global organization, it really takes work to figure out what's going on across the globe in terms of the organization. So things like short, frequent employee engagement surveys that ask very specific questions like, would you recommend working here to a friend? Do you feel like what you do matters? Are you committed to a career here? And I love this question, which is, it's something along the lines of, do you believe that the feedback to the survey will be anonymous? Do you believe that the feedback to the survey will be implemented and focused on? There are lots of things you can do to get a pulse, and they're called pulse surveys because they're typically short and frequent, and that matters. Another technique, in addition to, say, meeting not just the most senior levels of management, but layers down, a broader swath of leaders in the organization, high performers, that's another thing that can be done. I like to get information from call centers. So we all know as consumers that our interaction with call centers really colors our view of the company. And I don't think many boards get data, get anecdotal information, get comments as to what customer interactions with call centers looks like. And that can be an incredibly worthwhile technique, whether you're, on a very basic level, whether your customers are frustrated with your support, whether their interactions with you are positive, whether they feel like their needs are being met. Those kinds of really basic techniques can give you a range of data with which to get information and get a better handle on what's really going on.
Hey, Alan, let me mention just two quick things. One that a board member can do, and I was even doing, when I was in my executive position, I would go and do what I call kick the tires. When I was at a restaurant company, I would go and I would sit and be served and look at, and talk to the servers. I go out to the factories, walk the floors, talk to the employees. You have to go out where the employees are, all the way down the chain and look at, what's going on. Look at their workspaces, go into the restroom. Is it clean? Try to experience what they are experiencing and talk to them. And I will tell you, many times when I go to these locations, they have no idea who I am. Okay. They don't know that I'm a board member or I'm an executive officer. And therefore I get some really candid discussion. So that's the one thing. Go out and kick the tires and you will understand what's going on. The second thing is, I have one of the CEOs at one of my company at the board where I serve. He looks at Glassdoor. I wasn't familiar with Glassdoor, but I am now. He really looks at what are people saying when they interview here? What are people saying, when they exit here? What are employees saying today? So you get a pretty good idea of what's going on and whether the culture that you're seeking to create at the board level is really getting pushed down into the organization.
Mario? Best suggestions for assessing culture from the board level?
I think having skip level conversations with management is one way. In a healthy, functioning management team, what you'll find is a CEO saying, you have access to all my management team members whenever you want, whatever topic, and take advantage of that. I'm very fortunate. That's my experience in the board that I serve on. The CEO is just phenomenal, and I feel like I can speak to anybody on the team. And I do go a couple of steps down and speak to those team members. Not too often that I don't become a nuisance, right? You don't want to be that person either. But often enough that you have a read on, tell me what's on your mind. What's happening? Are you feeling? Are you happy? To the questions that Shelley asked or noted earlier is not quite would you recommend this company to your friend, but yeah, how do you see your career going here? ask those questions and get a read on whether the message you're getting as a board member matches what people are feeling.
Yep.
As much as you can get as a board member at the lower levels.
Yep. There are lots of questions here from the directors on the call. John Stout, can I get you to unmute and ask your question here?
Sure. My question relates to the decline in the rule of law, and I was asking whether you're seeing companies, management, directors thinking about that decline in the rule domestically in the US and also internationally, since it's a core to our society and business. And that decline has been well documented by the World Justice Project in the US and elsewhere. And it seems to me like a serious sustainability issue, partly because when you look at the elements of the sustainability continuum, the CSR, DEI, ESG that we've been talking about, et cetera, really all of those elements are supported by a lot of laws and regulations. I mean, think about clean air, clean water, all of, Superfund sites. And to the extent that the rule of law declines, those are going to go with it. And I'm curious whether any of your boards and management teams are thinking about this and how to kind of improve in some way or stand for improvements in the rule of law.
Who would like to take that on? While you're thinking about it, John, the one point I would make is that in the conversations I've had, one of the reasons we've made this move to stakeholder capitalism is because of sense among business leaders that government isn't doing its job. That in the Milton Friedman framework, the job of the social responsibility of a company is to make a profit, thank you very much, and obey the law. And you assume all the externalities and all the other problems are going to be dealt with by adequate legal structures. And as you point out, we live in a world where that's not happening the way most of us would like to see it happen, placing increased responsibility on corporations to rise to some of that challenge. I don't know if that answers your question, but I believe it's important context for the conversation.
Yeah, I guess the question is really, is the conversation happening and should it be?
I mean, I think I can address it from a slightly different angle. At one of the companies, we're, as I mentioned earlier, we're very much involved in sustainability issues, climate change issues, because that's the nature of our business, energy. And we are very much involved in participating in discussions that are taking place on Capitol Hill around the various legislation going on with regards to climate change. And as a matter of fact, our CEO is, one of the leaders of the energy industry getting involved in this. So, we have taken it as one of our principles, as one of our values and mission to be supportive of renewable energy and sustainability. And that means that a part of what we have to do is be at the forefront of legislative action. And we build relationships with the various, legislators, all the way from the White House to, Senate to Congress, to make sure that our voice is heard, our stakeholders' voices are heard, as well as at the same time, making sure that we are, being consistent with our fiduciary obligation to our shareholders, as well as we, merge all of these political issues related to energy into our corporate strategy. So that's just one way of approaching how we are stepping into the political space around law changes.
I'd love
Yeah.
to jump in as well as if I could, because I think it's an incredibly interesting question. And what comes to mind for me is sort of banding the time horizon. So an issue of immediacy and then a longer term issue. And I would say both of those issues have entered the boardrooms I'm involved in. And let me sort of explain it this way. On an immediate level, companies are involved in the safety and health of their employees. And I think that is more important than ever on a day-to-day basis. And that has become a boardroom issue is where do we operate? How do we operate? Do we need bus service? Do we need additional security? So really sort of the blocking and tackling that does get raised to a board level in terms of, at the end of the day, it's all about efficient capital allocation. So are we paying enough for these services for our employees? And then on a much longer time horizon, particularly in financial services, it is community impact, community involvement, banking the unbanked. It is community support so that the challenges, if you will, say of inner cities and of underserved communities, so that you are a good corporate citizen. And as we've talked about, that you do more in terms of the future of the country and the impact in places where maybe government hasn't done everything it needed to do, or maybe government hasn't been as successful. And having really a focus on community impact and community involvement also has become a boardroom issue.
And I'll add
yeah.
one more thing, if I could, Alan, to John's question. I think you're right, Shelley, really good question. I think at least from a board perspective, I mean, for us always to remember that just because it's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. And so we have to keep that in mind at all times. And it doesn't mean we have to pay more in taxes, for example, than the law demands, right? I mean, there's tax planning, we all do, et cetera. And that applies to many parts of the company's functions. But it does mean that we don't skirt the rules and that we don't push the boundaries to a degree where we're maybe agreeing to the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. That affects the rule of law, John. I think that begins to say you're turning a blind eye to something the company's doing just because it meets the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. Then there's a fine line that you're starting to be part of the problem, not part of the solution to this breakdown in rule of law that you mentioned. If I can give maybe two quick examples, Alan, because I think the last couple of years we've seen, one was COVID, and as a CFO of a company that's based out of Florida, Florida sort of did not have mask mandates for very long. Certainly, there wasn't a law that mandated the mask, but we knew it was the right thing for our team members. It was the right thing for our customers, although we don't have retail stores, but mostly for our team members to be at home and to also wear masks. And so highly encourage that. And so that is, you could say that was maybe against some of the guidance in the state, but it was important for us to do the right thing for the company and for our team members. And the other one is more closely to the retail environment. Now I'm putting on my Best Buy hat, but retail theft, it is a problem in some parts of the country. I think Target has talked about it, Walmart has talked about it, but that becomes an issue of are the laws being, to your point, John, are the laws being fully enforced in these localities? And if they're not, we should work towards having them enforced, because forget the financial impact, it is the customer safety impact, the team member safety impact that you have to worry about, where being a part of the solution to the strength of the rule of law matters even more than the financial impact of the company.
Sudhakar, you had a question about board skills. You want to come on, unmute and ask your question.
Sure, thank you, Alan. It's a great conversation. I have a few questions. Like in future board, as a future board member, what are the top skills you think is important? Given like all the skill sets and skill matrices and everything, but what are your top 3 to 5 skill sets you think future board member needs to be good with?
Who wants to take that first? The top new skill sets that the board needs to be looking at.
I think that well, it depends. And I'm a lawyer too, so I always say it depends. But you do have to look at your company, but let's take it a little bit more generically here. Certainly the ability to think, about innovation, and technology. You may not necessarily, have someone on your board, but you certainly want to have some amount of competencies in your boardroom to address those issues. So that's one that I think is important. I'll just put that one on the table, and then I'll defer to Shelley and to Mario.
I actually think that's a great point. And I think, I talk about really the same thing, maybe in a different way. I talk about digital DNA, but it's the ability to innovate and think about not the technology per se, but the changing business models. So I like to think about, when did Marriott realize that maybe their greatest competition is from Airbnb? When did Avis realize that maybe their greatest competition is from Uber, right? It's not the technology per se, but I think it's the changing business models. And again, to me, it's going back to first principles of, you as a board member are responsible for the sound and sustainable business model, right? And the viability of your entity, and really understanding changing business models. A lot of it is technologically driven. We all know that. And understanding how to think about that in the future, and also being courageous in terms of being willing to make tough decisions regarding that, right? We all know the Kodak story. They didn't want to cannibalize their own cash flow. So how can you as board members be pragmatic and yet courageous and bold in terms of thinking about changing business models and what the future looks like?
I agree with that, and I would add that the ability to think 10 to 20 years out, and I know that may seem sort of like, okay, yeah, we all do that as board members, but even challenging our own thinking of what the future could look like, having a futurist mindset helps. And what I really mean by that is, to Shelley's point, if you're Avis, if you're national, if you're enterprise, and you see this small startup in San Francisco, Uber, starting to ride hail through a phone, the first thing you need to think about is what is the company, how are we going to be positioned for that 10 years on the road, 20 years on the road? And if you're failing to do that, to quickly connect current events to how it's going to impact 20 years from now, then the company may not be rightly positioned, right? It's not, maybe the bearings are not quite right. And so you're going to be off track 10 years down the road.
Yeah.
It's a futurist mindset. It's a trader mindset. If you think about traders who have to make decisions very quickly, Russia invades Ukraine, potatoes or grain is going to go, grain, it's a bedrock of grains in Europe. You have to now think about, well, what happens to grain prices? That's how we have to think about as board members. If something's happening in China right now, what does that mean for us 10, 20 years on the road? And how do we position the company for that long trajectory change?
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it. Let me ask all three of you, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and you have an interesting collection of experiences and insights on the evolving board. I wonder, based on your work on the report, what, beyond the advice you've already given to people on the call, what's the best advice you would give them for navigating this really very different and evolving future that they're all dealing with?
I'll jump in. I work with a really top tier venture capitalist from the West Coast, and he has a great line, which is, what is the parade going to be for 10 years down the road? Meaning, what does success actually look like? And then what are the key things that will hold you back from having that parade? And I think it's sort of a basic way of saying, really thinking about what success looks like. And it sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but I think it goes back to, what is the purpose of your organization? What is it that makes you unique? How is it you serve your customers and the range of your constituencies in the best way? And so I think being, Mario used the word futurist, and I think Teresa really highlighted really well the idea of changing employee goals and values. What does the future look like 5, 10 years down the road? And how would you define success for your organization?
And
Yeah.
I will, oh, I'm sorry. I will pick up what Shelley said and maybe add a little bit of an element to it, because the way I look at it is, what is our risk profile going to look like in 5 years? But with that, with our focus on the future, what we learned from COVID and all the social activism was that we have to be agile and nimble as well. So we have this 5-year horizon and we're planning for that, but things are happening externally that may cause us to pivot even faster. And so we have to be ready to evaluate that risk profile in the short term. And how do we address that? And many companies were called to task, 2-3 years ago when COVID came on and all these other things, but also maintain that long-term view. So to me, and this is a term that when you read the Future of American Boards report, you will see it. The term is agility. How can we create an agile board?
Yeah. It's another way of thinking about the futurist issue. Mario, best advice.
I would say a couple of thoughts. One is when I think about the board that I sit on, and I'm super lucky to be in such a great company. I think I do ask myself, is every board member contributing to advancing the conversation, to thinking about all the topics that we just talked about and these principles and governance? And you have to be, you have to be even self-critical. Are you contributing to the conversation and moving the board forward? That, to me, that's super important. It's something I ask myself before every board meeting and between board meetings as well. What can I bring to the next discussion that's going to be important and meaningful? And the other one is, as a board member, our number one job is to select the CEO, but in a way to select the management team and to help the management team make really great decisions. So the question would be, is the management team for the company you serve on, are they equipped? Are they ready for the next phase of growth of the company or the next chapter of the life of the company? Just because they've been in role for 10 years and they've done a great job may not mean that they're going to be the best for the next 10 years of the company. And it's a tough sort of thought to have. And I can say this even as I sit in my own seat as CFO, but you have to think about, is the team ready for what comes next?
Yeah, and Mario, I would think that goes to the board as well as the executive team. I mean, traditionally, boards have been filled with people who have great experience, but that's not what any of you are talking about. You're not talking about experience. You're talking about agility. You're talking about foresight. You're talking about the ability to kind of have a sense for where things are headed and to move rapidly with that change. Might be an opportunity here to rethink the fundamental qualifications of the directors.
Alan,
go ahead, Shelley.
Sorry, from a colleague of mine who serves on a Fortune 50 board, because I am somebody who believes that you need to have board refresh and you need to be very focused on board skills. But I personally don't believe in the age limit, which is how many boards do it. They have a 72 age cutoff, which I wouldn't want to be the one to tell Charlie Munger that he's beyond his prime kind of thing. But she said, in order to have board agility, what they do is they commit in their NomGov charter, they commit that their board members will have a maximum average tenure, as opposed to something as sort of artificial as an age limit. And I just think that's a much more, if you will, a much more agile and thoughtful way to handle it.
Yeah, I like that. I as a 68-year-old guy, I don't think it's about age. I think it's about agility and foresight and willingness to continually learn. The three of you have been great. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I have to confess, at the beginning, I thought, wow, 90 minutes. Are we going to be able to fill 90 minutes? and I could go, and I can tell from the chat that the people on the call could go for another 90 minutes. But I don't think Kathy and Myron are going to allow us to do that. So let me at this point thank the three of you for a really great conversation and for all that you do and the thought that you've put into this, and turn it back to Kathy and Myron.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Shelley, Mario, Teresa. What a terrific, fantastic conversation, both once again on the screen and in the chat. So a couple quick announcements for those of you that are part of the Minneapolis or Minnesota chapter. If you are attending today's program, we're going to have a happy hour in April on Thursday evening, April 27th in downtown Minneapolis. Look for more details on that in the coming days. Love to have you there. Be an opportunity to network with some of your fellow directors and share more insights on today's program. Additionally, in May as well, we're going to have a program on ensuring the integrity of ESG reporting, co-sponsored with KPMG. Should be a terrific program. More will be coming out very soon on that program. So Kathy, thanks again for allowing us to partner with you on this terrific program. We look forward to more opportunities. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to share some of your upcoming events.
Thank you so much, Myron. It has been a pleasure to work with you and everyone in Minnesota on this as well. I just wanted to add a thought to the discussion, and that thought comes from my own experience as a member of large nonprofit boards, where these same issues come up with increasing frequency. And they're even extended so far in the museum world, for example, to thinking about how does a board define what is art? What is art going forward in the context of some of the discussions that we had for in this panel? Is it what traditionally we think of, you know, a lot of white guys from Europe, or is it increasingly taking into account people from all over the world, from various different kinds of cultures and activities? And all of that has its challenges for the nonprofit board members as well. So I think no matter where you are in this environment, if you're a board member, the issues that were addressed by this excellent panel are going to come into play. Turning to New England, on April 6th, we're going to virtually host a stakeholder activism and capitalism, latest trends and the role of the board. So that's going to mirror, I think, a lot of what was said in this program. And then on May 9th, we're going to host an in-person joint event with the Women Corporate Directors Organization, Stakeholder Capitalism Under Attack, a governing for the future board series. Again, a couple of topics, very, drawing on the threads of this excellent program. As a reminder, we are one NACD, and all the members of NACD can attend programs hosted by any other NACD chapter. While you have your primary chapter, in this case, Minneapolis, or Minnesota, I should say, or New England, you can still sign up for other chapter newsletters and attend all chapter events. So see the links in the chat and expand your options for great NACD programming. And finally, don't forget the survey. The link is in the chat and it will be in our follow-up emails. We really need your thoughts, we need your advice, and we need you to fill out the survey. So without further ado, let me adjourn the program.
Thank you all.